We can at the top of Daf Tazayin Amud Aleph in Meseches Nedarim. This is Nedarim Daf 16a. The Gemara says, Mani Mas Nisan, who is the author of our Mishnah? Rabbi Meir, it has to be that the author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. The Rabbi Yehuda, because if it were Rabbi Yehuda, lo shani le carbon, velo shani le ha carbon, he doesn't make a distinction between carbon and ha carbon, like our Mishnah makes that distinction. And the Mefarish over here says, Masnisan de hachaloka tani de lahave mutter ela ha carbon. In our Mishnah, it only says mutter by the case of ha carbon sha'ochel, velo carbon sha'ochel, but not by carbon, by ha carbon. So the Mishnah says that it's not a neder, that it's mutter, but it doesn't say that by carbon. V'ahachi Rabbi Meir he velo Rabbi Yehuda. Therefore, it's clear that our Mishnah has to be Rabbi Meir and not Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda would not make a distinction. He would say the same halacha would be true both by ha carbon and by carbon. And so therefore we know that the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir for that reason. But the Gemara says Ema Seifa, but look at the end of the Mishnah. The end of the Mishnah says La carbon lo ochelach mutter. If the person says La carbon lo ochelach, so then it's mutter. Problem is that's not consistent with Rabbi Meir. Vatnan, but we learned in the Mishnah La carbon lo ochelach, Rabbi Meir oser. It says if you say La carbon lo ochelach, Rabbi Meir says it's prohibited. Now why should that be prohibited? If the person is saying that it should be a carbon that which I do not eat, so then that which I eat should be mutter. But the answer is V'yomer Rabbi Abba. Rabbi Abba says Nasa ka'omer la carbon yehei. The explanation of Rabbi Meir is he understands it again that you put a separation there. This should be for a carbon. Lefikach lo ochelach. Therefore, I won't eat that which is of yours. And so therefore, la carbon lo ochelach, according to Rabbi Meir, is aser. And again, according to our Mishnah, that would be mutter. So it seems like it cannot be Rabbi Meir. And the Gemara answers, lo kasha is not difficult. Hada amar la carbon, hada amar lo la carbon. To lo have a carbon kamar. It depends if you say la carbon or lo la carbon. If you say la carbon, so then we understand it as lafikach. La carbon yehei, this should be a carbon. Lafikach lo chalach. Therefore, you do not eat it. That's where Rabbi Meir said aser. However, in our Mishnah, where it says mutter, it means to say lo la carbon. This should not be a carbon. And when you say lo la carbon, so in that case, it's going to be mutter. And the Mefarish over here explains, ema seifa, la carbon lo ochelach mutter v'atanan be'idach pirkin. In the other parak, we learn la carbon lo ochelach v'chulu, etc. We learned this earlier. Hada amar la carbon. So the ultimate answer was there's a difference between la carbon and low carbon. So if you say la carbon, it's aser. Umas nisan de katani mutter. Our Mishnah says mutter di amar lo la carbon means it's not a carbon. The mashma lo la have a carbon masha lo ochelach. Now in our Mishnah was a double negative. It should not be a carbon that which I don't eat. Now by implication that actually should create an isser. The imochel la have a carbon, because if I do eat it, it is a carbon. That which I do eat is a carbon. However, again, Rabbi Meir holds you can't have an isser by implication. Dahainu mechlal lavhein. That isser would only come through mechlal lavhein. From the fact that it says a negative, we can derive a positive. But for less leila, Rabbi Meir mechlal lavhein. Rabbi Meir holds you can't use an inference in order to create the isser. We've said that numerous times already, and therefore that's why Rabbi Meir would say, who's the author of our Mishnah, that's why Rabbi Meir would say when the person says lo la carbon, so then it's actually going to be mutter. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, shvua lo ochelach, ha shvua she'ochelach, or lo shvua lo ochelach. All of those different formulations, aser, the Mishnah says they will be aser. And the Mefarish says, shvua lo ochelach, ha shvua she'ochel aser. Can Mefarish be Gemara? This will be explained in the Gemara. The hai she'ochel lo ochel mashma. When it says over here, the first one makes sense. Shvua lo ochelach, he's making a shvua not to eat. Ha shvua she'ochelach, why is that going to make it aser to eat? And the reason is because when he says ha shvua she'ochel, it actually is mashma lo ochel. Kilomar shvua tehei chala alai im ochel. What it means is, there should be a shvua on me if I eat. It's also a way of saying, you're not going to eat. Now, when he says shvua over here, it doesn't mean by the life of the shvua. The shvua less by mamish kemo bekarban, el shvua mamish ka'amar. That's only you only say by a carbon. You say it could mean chaye carbon, but by a shvua you don't have that issue. When he says the word shvua, he clearly means an actual shvua, an actual oath. Finally, the last case of the Mishnah was lo shvua lo ochelach aser. If he says lo shvua lo ochelach aser, now this again would seem to be an isser through implication. It's not a shvua that which I don't eat. That which I do eat, I am making a shvua. So therefore, it would seem it cannot go like Rabbi Meir. However, the Mefarish says afilu Rabbi Meir. This even goes according to Rabbi Meir. Dehachi gamrinon b'Meseches shvuas de b'shvua. Rabbi Meir says when it comes to shvua, and the idea some Rishonim say is that shvua is isser, and by isser it's different. The b'shvua is like Rabbi Meir. When you're talking about something that's completely in the category of Isser, so then Rabbi Meir actually does hold of Mechlal Lav Ata Shomea Hein. As the Ran over here explains, the Chilesle Rabbi Meir Mechlalav Atashomehain Hani Mili B'Mamona Inami B'Isura D'Isbe Mamona. By Mammon or by Isra that can encompass Mammon, that's where he doesn't hold a Mechlalav Atashomehain. Aval B'Isura Greda Isle, by something that is just an Isra, he does hold of it. O Nedarim Isura D'Isbe Mamona Ninu. Now Nedarim, as opposed to Shua, Nedarim is an Isra that can contain Mammon. Mishum Delo Mashkachas Bubulo Chefza. You need a Chefza, as we've said many times. The Neder is not Chal on the person, the Neder is Chal on the item. A Neder can't be Chal on something without substance. Aval Shvuas Einon Elo Isura Greda Shu Chol Begufo. But Shvuas, which is just something that is an Isser, so therefore V'kevan D'Isura Greda Ninu Afil Rabbi Meir Moda Ta'amrin B'hu Mechlal Lav Atashomeyahin. Even Rabbi Meir would admit, when it comes to Shvuah, that you can say Mechlal Lav Atashomeyahin. And the Gemara says, Mechlal deha shvua she'ochelach. Now the implication of our Mishnah is, as the Mefarish already mentioned, that when you say ha shvua she'ochelach, the lo achil namashma. It's really what you're making is a shvua that you're not going to eat. Even though you use the word she'ochelach, sounds like you are going to eat, it actually means you are not going to eat. And the Gemara says, Uraminu, we have the following contradiction. Shavuos shtayim shein arba. When it comes to Shavuos, there are two that are sourced directly in the Torah, and it's two which are four, meaning there are two additional ones that are derived from drasha. Sha'ochel v'shalo-ochel. First, there's the Shavuos that are direct from the Torah. Those are Shavuos that I'm going to eat or I am not going to eat in the future tense. Sha'achalti v'shalo-achalti. And then there's also the ones that are learned from a drasha, that's that I ate or that I didn't eat. And so the Gemara now says, from the fact that the language of this Mishnah over here is shalo ochel, sha'achalti, shalo achalti, mechlal, that implies the sha'ochel loch da'achil namashma. That sounds like when the person says sha'ochel, that he is actually going to eat. In other words, in that Mishnah, in the Mishnah which says shvua shtayim shein arba she'ochel v'shalo ochel, sha'ochel sounds like he's making a shvua to eat. Shalo ochel sounds like he's making a shvua not to eat. And that does not seem like our Mishnah where Hashvua sha'ochel is really a shvua not to eat. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Abaya says, Sha'ochel shtei lashonos mashma. Sha'ochel can actually go both ways. When you make a shvua sha'ochel, you can interpret it in both ways. Hayu misarvin bo lechel. Let's say, for example, they're pushing him to eat, they're pressuring him to eat. V'amar achilna, and he says, I'm going to eat. V'su shvua sha'ochel, de achilna mashma. And then he says further, I'm taking a shvua that I'm going to eat. Then, when you say that language, de achilna mashma, then it is mashma, that he's taking an oath that he will eat. Avalamar lo achilna. But let's say he says, I'm not going to eat. V'su amar shvua sha'ochel, and then he says shvua sha'ochel, the lo achil nakamar. There, when he's saying shvua sha'ochel, it actually means to say that he's not going to eat. So it all depends on the context. And the Gemara continues, Ravashi says, sha'ochel de shvua, she'i ochel ka'amar. He gives a different answer. He says that when it says sha'ochel by shvua over here, it actually means to say she'i ochel, that I will not eat. So even though in the Mishnah it says sha'ochel, it actually means she'i ochel. And when he says she'i ochel, it's a shvua that he's not going to eat. Gemara says, Imkain Pshita, if that's the case, it's obvious. Of course that's a situation. The Mefarish says, Pshita devada ikamar she'ochel, vada lo achilna hu v'aser. Obviously, if a person says she'ochel, that he's not going to eat, that's a shvua not to eat, and it's aser to eat. And so therefore, Ma'ila Memra, so what's even the Chiddush over there? And the Gemara says, no, Ma'u Detema, because what might you have thought? Mekam Lishna Hi de Iskale. Maybe he stumbled over his words, and we can't necessarily assume that he means She'i Ochel. Kamash Malana teaches us, no, if we hear him say She'i Ochel, then we interpret it as we heard it, and we understand it to mean She'i Ochel, that he will not eat. The Mefarish over here says, Ma'u Detema, Hai de Kamar She'i Ochel, Mekam Lishna Klamar Tikun Alashanu, Devedait Vayolomar She'ochel V'niskal. Maybe he really wanted to say She'ochel, and he stumbled over his words, and he said she'iochel v'yamar she'iochel v'neima liolam lahavik command amar she'ochel kamash malon delo devada yasser. Maybe you'll say we should interpret it as if he said she'ochel. We do not, since we heard him say she'iochel. The interpretation is that he will not eat. And the Gemara continues, Abaye lu amar tam ki Ravashi. Now Abaye did not go with Ravashi's answer that she'ochel is she'iochel, to lo katani she'iochel, because it doesn't say in the Mishnah she'iochel, it says she'ochel. So he didn't want to give an interpretation that went against the words of the Mishnah. Ravashi nodim in tam di Abaye, and Ravashi, he distanced himself from the explanation of Abaye. Abaye again interpreted it based on the context, because he holds shelo ochel nami mashma shtei lashonos, because even shelo ochel could also be, you can always have a situation situations where the context will change it. You can even have a person say shelo ochel, and it can be mashma both directions. For example, as follows: Hayu mesarvin bo lechel. Let's say they're pressuring him to eat. V'yamar lo achilna, and he says, I haven't eaten. V'yamar nami shvu, and he says a shvua bein she'ochel, bein shelo ochel. Whether he says the language of she'ochel or shelo ochel, you can interpret it rhetorically. In other words, the person says, will I not eat? Or it could be, will I eat? Or I won't eat. So hadein achil namashma, in such a situation, that's what he's saying over here. In such a situation, if they're pressuring him and they say you should eat, and he says, I won't eat, a shvua, I won't eat, we can understand it as rhetorical. Shvua, that I'm not going to eat, of course I'm going to eat. Hadein achil namashma, that will certainly be mashma. Even though he said lo ochel, he means to say that he will eat. Diyamar, that's what he's saying. And of course, you could also understand shvua shelo ochel, meaning a shvua that he's not going to eat. It can always go in every direction. Elatana paska, rather, it must be the Tana is always going to make a clear distinction. We're not going to try to figure out what the Mishnah means other than what the Mishnah says. She'ochel da'achil namashma. If the Tana says she'ochel, it means that I am going to eat. V'shelo ochel, and if it says shelo ochel, lo ochel mashma, it means I'm not going to eat. In other words, Rav Ashi doesn't want to say like Abaya, that you can have a term in the Mishnah that clearly seems like she'ochel, clearly seems to mean di'achilna, and we're going to interpret it another way because of context, because if you say that, you can always give some other context and give some other interpretation. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Zeh chomer b'shavuos mi b'nedarim. That which we said earlier, that is a stringency by Shavuos more than Nedarim. V'chomer b'nedarim mi b'shavuos. And how do we have a stringency by Nedarim more than Shavuos? We can have as follows, where Neder is more chomer than Shavua. Ketzad how so? Amar konim sukkah shani osa, lulav shani notel, tefillin shani meniach. Let's say he says a konim, meaning a language of a Neder, not a language of a Shavua, and he says a Neder not to do the mitzvah of sukkah, not to do the mitzvah of lulav, not to do the mitzvah of tefillin, not to put on tefillin, not to take the lulav, etc. So by nedarim, that actually will be effective. Even though you're doing a neder not to do a mitzvah, it's still effective, and it's usher to do those mitzvahs now. You now have a neder not to do it. B'shvuos mutter, but by shvuos it's still going to be mutter, because she'ein nishboin lavor ala mitzvahs, because you don't make an oath to transgress the mitzvahs, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tazayin Amud Beis.